Hello again, friends. I'm glad you could join me again. So last week we left off with the Renaissance. 1400 to 1600 we generally think of as the Renaissance, 1500 being the High Renaissance. And the Medici family, Cosimo and then his son Lorenzo de' Medici, who were bankers in Florence, Italy, and amassed wealth and used that wealth to pay artists to create art, to convey truth, wisdom, and beauty. So Lorenzo de' Medici died about the same time that Columbus came to America, 1490s. Lorenzo's grandson took control of the seat of Florence, and his grandson actually would eventually become Pope Leo X. And Leo X has the distinct honor of being the Pope that excommunicated Martin Luther in 1520. Lorenzo de' Medici's nephew also at one time had control of the seat of Florence, and he became Pope Clement VII. So you can see that in the Renaissance, wealth, power, and control was very closely related to politics and the Catholic Church. Lorenzo's nephew, who was the last Medici to have control of Florence, eventually lost control of Florence to the church, and the Medici family was expelled from Florence in 1527. So a lot happens between 1490 and 1530. Columbus comes to Hispaniola in search of trade route as well as wealth. He's searching for gold. Pizarro comes to Central America in search of wealth and gold and annihilates the Incan population. Cortez comes and annihilates the Mayan population in search of gold. So this notion of imperialism is born. Imperialism is where a country has satellite ports because they realized that if trade, you remember this idea of the merchant class that was trading now, they realized how important trade was. And if you controlled the trade ports, you controlled the transfer of wealth. So Magellan circumnavigates the world, first person to do so, all in search of wealth and trade routes. Henry VIII ascends the throne in England and leaves the Catholic Church, the beginning of the Anglican Church. Leonardo in 1502-3 begins painting the Mona Lisa. And actually Leonardo never finishes the Mona Lisa. He paints and works on it the rest of his life. Michelangelo, at the same time, 1502, is carving the David. At the same time, Raphael is working. So 1500 is a tremendous period in history. A little later, 1519, 1517, Martin Luther begins the Protestant Reformation. You'll recall at the time that the church, the Mass, because the Catholic Church is what existed in Europe, the Mass was in Latin. Well, no one spoke Latin anymore because Latin had morphed into Italian. And if you want to see how this works, read a work like Beowulf, which is in Old English, or the Canterbury Tales in Middle English. And even reading Middle English, you can almost figure out what the words are saying, but they're very, very different. So if you want to know how a language changes over 1,000 years, start by reading the Canterbury Tales. You'll see how that works. So Latin was not spoken anymore, although it was still part of the Catholic Church. which is part of the reasons for the Protestant Reformation. Music. What happens in music at the time? Well, from the Middle Ages, we have church music. As I say, that was still done in predominantly Latin. You also have the peasant music, the music of the common folk, which was dance music. The piece that I played to start this session is a piece that I made up to kind of demonstrate the dance quality to music in the Renaissance. Also to show the differences in the instrumentation that was being developed. The Renaissance had flutes, which are very similar to the flutes that we have now, except they were not mechanical action. You simply covered a hole with your finger. The chromatic possibilities we have now, it didn't exist then. The fife, the flute, really played in whatever key it was made in. Then you had reeds, the precursor to the oboe and the English horn, the crumb horn. If you imagine a clarinet with an oboe reed and a trumpet mouthpiece, the crumb horn. There were also the precursors of the modern trumpet, which were cornets, which if you imagine a clarinet, a wooden clarinet with a trumpet mouthpiece, that was the trumpet at the time. So they went back and forth between the flute and the reed. Those were the instruments of the commoner, because they were fairly inexpensive to make. Strings also were being invented at the time, but they were not the modern strings. The violin didn't exist. The viola didn't exist. The cello didn't exist. But we had a precursor to those, which was the viol family, V-I-O-L, which is where we get violin, viola. There was a viol da gamba, which was the precursor to the cello. But these had different number of strings. They would have 6 strings. They could have 8 strings. They were played similarly, but they were still a little bit softer. So you had church music, which was predominantly for the church. It was in Latin. It was choral. There were no instruments in the church. That was considered ostentatious. The organ really didn't exist in the church at the time. It wasn't a predominant instrument. So you had choral music. Interestingly enough, women were not allowed to sing in the church. So men only, bass tenor, countertenor sang the alto part, and boys, which is where we get the boys' choirs, boys sang the soprano part. Most people couldn't read, so there were no hymn books. The congregation didn't sing except simple responses, and the sung responses were in Latin, which is why the folk music was so important to the common folk. There's another new kind of music that developed during the Renaissance, and that was performance music. The kings, the dukes, the earls, the viscounts of the time, they had courts and they had courtiers. And when you're hanging out in a castle all day, you tend to run out of things to do. So the counts gathered musicians together and said, write me a piece in my honor and then perform it. So because of these court musicians that actually made a living working under the hire of a count, a viscount, a duke, these were the first musicians that were paid to write music for anything other than the church. So in the Renaissance, we developed dance music. We had the music of the church. And for the first time, we had performance music. And this performance music is what led to developments in Baroque. That's our next music style. We'll talk about that next week. Peace to you.